Let's talk about something most people never realize they're doing wrong when they were dealing with an avoidant. And this is where everything silently collapses. Ignoring you only works when you keep explaining yourself. That's the uncomfortable truth. Not because you're weak, not because you don't have value, but because every time you over-explain, over-justify, or over-communicate your pain, you unknowingly train the avoidant nervous system that distance is safe, comfortable, and consequence-free. Think about it psychologically. The avoidant isn't wired to respond to emotional intensity the way you are. They don't interpret your explanations as depth or love. They interpret them as pressure. And when pressure appears, their instinct isn't to move closer, it's to pull away. So when you keep sending messages explaining how much they hurt you, how much you care, how much you're confused, you think you're building understanding. What you're actually doing is relieving their discomfort. You're making it easier for them to stay distant while still knowing you're emotionally available. Here's the philosophical layer most people miss. Human behavior changes not through words, but through consequences. You can talk to someone about respect for hours, but if your behavior doesn't require it, nothing changes. Avoidants learn through absence, not argument. They learn through pattern disruption, not emotional persuasion. And every explanation you give becomes a psychological cushion that protects them from ever feeling the weight of losing you. Notice this pattern carefully. When you explain, you are still engaged. When you explain, you are still available. When you explain, you are still emotionally investing energy into someone who is withholding theirs. That imbalance is the real issue. The avoidant doesn't wake up one day and think, I should step up. They wake up when the emotional system they relied on is suddenly unavailable. Not hostile, not dramatic, just unavailable. And this is where people get uncomfortable because they confuse dignity with silence. Silence isn't punishment. Silence is clarity. Silence says, I will not argue my worth. Silence says, if you want access to me, there is a standard. Silence is not about manipulating the avoidant. It's about removing the safety net that allowed neglect to continue. From a psychological standpoint, explanations keep the attachment bond asymmetrical. You are signaling, I'm here, even if you aren't. That message is soothing to an avoidant. It tells them they can disappear without losing connection. But when you stop explaining, something very different happens internally for them. The mind starts filling in the gaps. The nervous system notices the absence. The comfort of knowing you'll always reach out disappears. And that's when reflection begins. This isn't about becoming cold or closed. It's about becoming grounded. You're not withdrawing to get a reaction. You're withdrawing because self-respect requires limits. And limits are only real when they're enforced through behavior, not speeches. Here's the paradox. The moment you stop trying to be understood is often the moment you finally are. Because understanding doesn't come from hearing your words. It comes from feeling your absence. An absence, when paired with calm confidence, creates a psychological vacuum the avoidant can't ignore. So if you want to teach an avoidant the price of ignoring you, it starts here. You stop explaining. You stop narrating your pain. You stop rescuing the connection alone. Not because you don't care, but because you care enough about yourself to let reality speak louder than your emotions ever could. And the reflection I'll leave you with is simple but unsettling. If someone only values you when you explain yourself, they never valued you, they valued your availability. Now here's where most people misunderstand silence, and this misunderstanding is why it fails for them. Silence becomes powerful only when it comes with self-elevation. Without that, silence is just waiting. And waiting is still attachment in disguise. A lot of people go quiet, hoping to be missed, hoping the avoidant will suddenly wake up, feel the loss, and come running back. But psychologically, that kind of silence is still reactive. It's still centered on the other person. And avoidants can feel that. They sense when your silence is empty, when it's filled with anxiety, rumination, and anticipation. That kind of silence doesn't unsettle them. It reassures them. It tells them, I'm still here emotionally. I'm just quieter. Powerful silence is different. Powerful silence isn't about absence alone. It's about transformation. It's when your absence is paired with visible emotional stability, groundedness, and forward motion. That's when the dynamic shifts. Because now the avoidant isn't just dealing with the loss of contact. They're dealing with the loss of influence. From a psychological standpoint, avoidants regulate their nervous system through distance. They feel safest when intimacy is controlled, predictable, and on their terms. As long as you remain emotionally stagnant, waiting, watching, hoping, they don't feel threatened. But when your silence is paired with self-elevation, something happens internally for them. Their usual strategy stops working. Self-elevation doesn't mean pretending to be happy or posting performative confidence. It's internal first. It's when you stop organizing your inner world around their behavior. Your days become fuller. Your identity becomes less relationally dependent. Your emotional state becomes less reactive. And here's the key. You don't announce this shift. You embody it. Avoidants are extremely sensitive to emotional pressure, but they're also highly attuned to emotional absence. When you elevate yourself, your energy changes. You're no longer reaching. You're no longer available on demand. You're no longer subtly signaling, please choose me. That's when their nervous system starts scanning for what changed. Philosophically, this is about reclaiming authorship over your own life. When your worth is tied to someone else's attention, silence feels like deprivation. But when your worth is anchored internally, silence becomes space. Space to grow, to stabilize, to expand. And expansion is threatening to an avoidant who assumed you would always stay where they left you. This is why some people go silent and nothing happens, while others go silent and trigger a complete internal shift in the avoidant. The difference isn't time, it's posture. One person withdraws and waits, the other withdraws and rises. When self-elevation is present, your silence communicates something words never could. It says, my life is moving. It says, I am no longer paused. It says, you are no longer the center of my emotional universe. And that message lands deeply because it removes the avoidant sense of control without confrontation or conflict. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Avoidants don't fear losing you emotionally as much as they fear losing relevance in your life. When they sense that you're no longer orienting around them, their internal balance is disrupted. The distance that once felt safe starts to feel uncertain. And notice, you didn't chase, you didn't punish, you didn't manipulate. You simply chose growth. That's why this works. Because it's not about getting a reaction. It's about becoming someone who no longer needs one. Silence without self-elevation is passive. Silence with self-elevation is decisive. One keeps you stuck in longing. The other reclaims your power. So if you're going to go quiet, don't do it halfway. Don't disappear and emotionally linger. Disappear and evolve. Let your absence be filled with momentum, not hope. And here's what I want you to sit with. The silence that changes everything is never about making them miss you. It's about making sure you never abandon yourself again. There's something critical you need to understand about avoidance if you want to stop personalizing their behavior and start seeing it clearly. Avoidants don't panic when they lose attachment. They panic when they lose access. That distinction changes everything. Attachment to an avoidant is emotionally overwhelming. It activates vulnerability, dependency, and exposure. Things their nervous system learned early on. N were unsafe. So when intimacy deepens, their instinct is to retreat. That part you already know. But what most people miss is this. While they pull away from emotional closeness, they still rely on access to you, access to your attention, access to your availability, access to the reassurance that you're still there, still waiting, still reachable. As long as that access exists, they don't feel urgency. They don't feel lost. They feel regulated. Psychologically, access is their safety net. It allows them to maintain distance without consequence. They can ignore messages, delay responses, disappear emotionally because somewhere in the background, they believe you're still emotionally connected, still thinking about them, still open, still an option. And as long as they believe that, their system stays calm. This is why emotional appeals don't work. This is why explaining your feelings doesn't shift their behavior. Because you're addressing attachment while their nervous system is anchored to access. You're speaking the language of closeness. They're responding to the language of control. When access is removed, something very different happens internally. Not externally, internally. Their usual regulation strategy collapses. The silence no longer feels neutral. It feels unfamiliar. The emotional supply they subconsciously relied on is gone. And now, instead of you feeling anxious, they do. This isn't manipulation. This is cause and effect. When you stop being available on demand, emotionally, energetically, psychologically, you introduce uncertainty. And uncertainty is deeply activating for someone who relies on predictability to stay detached. Suddenly they don't know where they stand. Suddenly they don't know if they can come back whenever they want. Suddenly the dynamic isn't under their control, and control is the real issue here. Avoidants often confuse Control with safety. They feel safe when they can dictate distance, when they can approach and retreat without resistance, when they can disengage knowing you'll remain emotionally present. But the moment that access disappears, the illusion of control shatters. This is why some avoidants reappear after long periods of silence. Not because they process their feelings in a healthy way, but because the loss of access triggered reflection. The absence forced awareness. The mind begins asking questions it never had to ask before. Did I misjudge this? Did I push too far? What if they're really gone? And notice something important. You didn't demand anything. You didn't confront. You didn't pressure. You didn't chase. You simply removed access. That's what makes this so powerful. It bypasses defensiveness and speaks directly to the nervous system. Philosophically, this is about boundaries being real, not theoretical. Anyone can say, I deserve better. But boundaries only exist when behavior changes, when access is limited, when availability is no longer unconditional. And for the avoidant, that's when the lesson finally lands. This is also where people get stuck emotionally. They worry, what if they don't come back? And that question reveals the deeper work, because the goal isn't to provoke return. The goal is to stop organizing your worth around whether someone chooses you once access is gone. If they return with more awareness, consistency, and respect, that's information. If they don't, that's also information. Either way, you win clarity. And clarity is always power. So understand this deeply. Avoidants don't change when you prove how much you care. They change when they feel the cost of losing access to you. And that cost can only be felt when you are no longer standing at the door waiting. The reflection I'll leave you with is this. If someone only values you, when access is threatened, then your greatest responsibility is not to convince them, but to decide whether access should ever be that easy again. Now let's address the part that almost everyone gets wrong, even when they understand everything we've talked about so far. It's not silence that teaches the lesson, it's consistency. And consistency is quiet, disciplined, and emotionally mature. Drama, on the other hand, resets their comfort every single time. Here's why this matters psychologically. Avoidants are not moved by emotional spikes. Intense reactions, long messages, confrontations, emotional breakdowns, sudden declarations don't register as boundaries to them. They register as instability. And instability, paradoxically, makes them feel more in control. Because if your emotions are erupting, it means you're still emotionally hooked. You're still reacting to them. You're still revolving around their behavior. One emotional outburst after a period of silence can undo weeks of progress, not because you messed up, but because it reopens the access we talked about earlier. It tells their nervous system, the door is still open. I just have to wait long enough. That restores their comfort. And once comfort returns, there's no motivation to change. Consistency works because it removes confusion. When your behavior is calm, predictable, and grounded over time, the avoidant can't explain it away. They can't tell themselves they're just upset or they'll calm down and come back. Instead, they're forced to face a new reality. This isn't a reaction. This is a shift. Philosophically, this is about integrity between what you say you deserve and how you live. Anyone can state a boundary in an emotional moment, but boundaries only become real when they are upheld without theatrics, without speeches, without reminders, when your behavior quietly reinforces why. Our standards day after day. Avoidants are experts at waiting out emotional storms. They learned early on that intensity fades, that people calm down, that distance eventually restores equilibrium. Drama plays directly into that strategy, but consistency disrupts it, because consistency doesn't fade. It doesn't argue. It doesn't negotiate. This is why the lesson feels slow at first. You don't see immediate reactions. There's no dramatic chase, no sudden confession. And that can be uncomfortable if you're used to equating intensity with progress. But internally, something very different is happening. The avoidance starts noticing patterns. The mind starts tracking change. The absence becomes stable, not temporary. Consistency also shifts you. And this is crucial. When you stop reacting emotionally, you reclaim your nervous system. You're no longer riding the highs and lows of their attention. You're no longer waiting for signals. You're anchored. And that internal stability is what ultimately makes you untouchable. From a psychological perspective, consistency creates cognitive dissonance for the avoidant. Their old assumptions no longer match reality. They'll always respond. They'll always explain. They'll always come back emotionally. When those assumptions are repeatedly disproven by calm behavior, something has to give. Either they adapt or they disengage completely. Both outcomes bring truth. And here's the part most people don't want to hear. If consistency pushes them away permanently, it didn't cost you the relationship. It revealed it. A connection that only survives emotional chasing and dramatic repair was never built on mutual respect. It was built on imbalance. Consistency is not coldness. It's not punishment. It's not playing games. It's simply no longer participating in a dynamic that requires you to destabilize yourself to be chosen. And on. CE, that dynamic ends, the avoidant is forced to meet you on equal ground. Or not meet you at all. This is where your power truly returns. Not when they react. Not when they reach out. But when you realize you no longer need to prove, explain, or perform your worth. You live it. So understand this clearly. One emotional reaction can feel relieving in the moment, but it teaches nothing. Calm, grounded consistency teaches everything. And here's what I want you to reflect on as you move forward. The lesson that changes people isn't delivered through intensity. It's delivered through who you refuse to stop being, no matter how they behave. Now we arrive at a moment that quietly changes everything, even though it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. The moment they feel replaceable, everything changes. Not because you tried to make them jealous, not because you threatened to leave, but because reality finally caught up with the story they were telling themselves. Avoidants often operate from an unspoken assumption: you'll be there, not aggressively, not loudly, just reliably. They assume your emotional position in their life is fixed, that no matter how distant they become, how inconsistent their effort is, how long they disappear, your role remains reserved. And as long as that assumption holds, there is no urgency to change. Replaceability disrupts that illusion. Psychologically, this isn't about another person entering the picture. It's about possibility entering the picture. The avoidant begins to sense, not intellectually, but emotionally, that your life is no longer orbiting them, that your future is no longer paused, that you are no longer anchored to their indecision. This is deeply unsettling for someone who regulates themselves through control. Understand this clearly. Avoidants don't feel safe because they don't care. They feel safe because they believe the why are not at risk of being left behind emotionally. Replaceability introduces risk, and risk activates awareness. When they notice you are busier, more fulfilled, more grounded, less reactive, something shifts internally. They start recalculating. The mind begins to ask questions it never had to ask before. What if they move on? What if I misjudge this? What if I'm no longer special to them? These thoughts don't come from jealousy. They come from destabilization. Philosophically, this is where attachment meets identity. The avoidant sense of self is often reinforced by being wanted without having to fully show up, being irreplaceable without being fully present. When that dynamic breaks, they're forced to confront something uncomfortable. Their value is no longer guaranteed by your tolerance. And here's the paradox most people miss. You don't make yourself replaceable by lowering your standards. You make yourself replaceable by raising them. You stop advertising exclusivity to someone who hasn't earned it. You stop structuring your life around someone who hasn't chosen you consistently. And in doing so, you become more attractive, not less. Why? Because grounded independence signals abundance. And abundance is magnetic. It says, I choose, I'm not waiting to be chosen. That posture fundamentally changes the power dynamic. This is also where many people sabotage themselves. They think replaceability must be communicated, explained, announced. But true replaceability is felt, not declared. It's sensed in your absence, in your lack of urgency, in the way your energy no longer spikes around them, in the way your happiness no longer depends on their response. Avoidants are extremely perceptive when it comes to emotional shifts. They notice when you stop checking, when you stop initiating, when you stop lingering emotionally. They feel it when their importance quietly decreases. And that's when everything accelerates internally. But here's the crucial part. Replaceability is not a tactic. If you treat it like one, it collapses. This only works when it's real, when you genuinely accept that your life can be rich, meaningful, and forward-moving with or without them. That acceptance changes your tone, your posture, your decisions. It changes the way you show up everywhere. And if they respond to that shift by stepping up, by becoming more present, more consistent, more emotionally available, that's information. If they don't, that's also information. Both outcomes restore your power because neither requires you to shrink. The real transformation here isn't theirs. It's yours. You move from being someone who waits to be valued to someone who expects alignment. And alignment cannot be negotiated. It can only be matched. So let this settle deeply. The moment someone realizes they are no longer central to your sense of self, they either rise or they fall away. Both outcomes are honest. Both outcomes are liberating. And the reflection I'll leave you with is this: the day you stop trying to be irreplaceable is often the day you finally become impossible to ignore. And now we reach the point that most people never fully grasp, even after they've done everything right. The real price the avoidant pays is not missing you. It's not loneliness. It's not even regret in the way people usually imagine it. The real price is losing the version of you they felt safe neglecting. That version of you, the one who waited, explained, accommodated, tolerated inconsistency, that version served a purpose in their emotional ecosystem. It allowed them to stay avoidant without consequences. It allowed them to take space without loss. It allowed them to regulate their nervous system while outsourcing emotional stability to you. And as long as that version of you existed, the relationship could remain exactly as it was. When that version disappears, something profound happens. Psychologically, avoidants rely on familiarity more than they rely on connection. They may resist closeness, but they are deeply attached to predictability. They feel safest when they know exactly who you are, how you'll respond, and how much access they have. When you fundamentally change, when you stop being endlessly available, endlessly understanding, endlessly patient, the ground beneath them shifts. This is why the impact often shows up later, not immediately. At first, they may feel relief. Distance feels comfortable. Silence feels manageable. But over time, something unsettles them. The familiar pattern doesn't resume. You don't return to your old role. You don't reopen emotionally the way you used to. And that's when loss becomes real. They're not just losing you, they're losing certainty. From a philosophical perspective, this is the death of an identity dynamic. The avoidant identity was partially constructed in contrast to you, the one who stayed, the one who absorbed the emotional labor, the one who made the relationship work even when they pulled away. When that person no longer exists, the avoidant is forced to confront themselves without the buffer you provided, and this is deeply uncomfortable. It's also where true reflection can begin, not because you demanded accountability, but because the environment that protected them from accountability no longer exists. The mirror is suddenly clear. They may start replaying moments, rethinking choices, questioning assumptions they never questioned before. I thought they'd always be there. I didn't think they'd actually change. I didn't think I'd lose access to that version of them. That realization cuts deeper than anger ever could. But here's the part you need to hear just as clearly. This outcome is not guaranteed to produce reconciliation. Sometimes it produces growth. Sometimes it produces regret. Sometimes it produces distance forever. And none of those outcomes mean you failed, because the purpose of this journey was never to teach them a lesson at the expense of yourself. It was to stop paying the cost of being someone who could be neglected without consequence. When you become someone who cannot be taken for granted, the entire dynamic shifts, whether with them or with someone new. You no longer enter relationships hoping to be chosen. You enter them expecting reciprocity. You stop trying to preserve connections that require self-abandonment. You stop mistaking endurance for love. And here's the paradox. When the avoidant realizes the version of you they felt safe neglecting is gone, they may finally see your value clearly. But by then, you're no longer waiting to be seen. You're evaluating whether access to you still makes sense. That's power, quiet power, earned power,